There are places in America where the silence is so complete, so absolute, that you can hear the wind coming from 3 miles away. Places where neighbors know one another by the sound of their trucks, where children ride bikes to school, where front doors go unlocked until well past dark. Lander, Wyoming is one of those places. Nestled against the eastern slope of the Wind River Range, it sits at an elevation of 5,357 feet, a small city of roughly 7,000 souls surrounded by sage flats, red rock formations, and the kind of open sky that makes people feel simultaneously free and exposed. In the summer of 2002, Lander was exactly the kind of place where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. And then, on a Tuesday morning in late July, something terrible did. A young woman named Sherry Ann Metz, 31 years old, a mother of 2 small children, a part-time bookkeeper at a local feed supply company, simply ceased to exist. She was there and then she was not. Her car was in the driveway. Her coffee cup sat half full on the kitchen counter, still warm to the touch when deputies arrived. Her children were at home, unsupervised, the youngest barely old enough to explain what she had seen. No forced entry. No signs of a struggle in the conventional sense. No note. No body. Nothing but a half-warm cup of coffee and 2 small children who kept asking the same question that would haunt investigators for the next 19 years. Where did Mama go? She was not, by any measure, a woman who disappeared easily from the lives of those around her. Sherry Ann Metz, born Sherry Ann Caldwell in Riverton, Wyoming, in 1971, was the kind of person who remembered birthdays without being reminded, who brought casseroles to sick neighbors before anyone thought to ask. Those who knew her in those years described her as bright and practical, with a streak of dry humor that surprised people who expected someone quieter. She had grown up in Fremont County, graduated from Riverton High School in 1989, and spent 2 years at Central Wyoming College before moving to Lander in the mid-1990s, following a relationship that eventually became a marriage. By 2002, she was the mother of 2 daughters, Kayla, age 7, and Brianna, age 4. She worked 3 days a week at the Fremont Feed and Supply office on Main Street, where her employer, a man named Gus Hartwell, later described her as meticulous and dependable. She never missed a day without calling first, Hartwell told investigators. Never once. Her husband was Dale Metz, 34 years old, a self-employed contractor who handled residential construction and small renovation projects across Fremont County. He was lean and quiet, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned early in life that speaking carefully was better than speaking much. He had grown up in Sublette County, moved to Lander in 1994, and met Sherry at a 4th of July gathering at the Fremont County Fairgrounds. They married in 1996. By all outward appearances, theirs was an ordinary working-class life. The mortgage on a 3-bedroom house on Sagebrush Lane, a used Ford pickup registered to Dale, a 1998 Dodge Neon registered to Sherry, church attendance that had grown sporadic in recent years, Little League signups for Kayla's upcoming season. Ordinary. Deliberately ordinary. The kind of life that reveals its hidden architecture only when something breaks. July 23, 2002 began the way most late July mornings begin in Lander. Dry and already warm by 7 in the morning, the air carrying the faint mineral smell of sage and heated earth, the sky above the Wind Rivers so deeply blue it looked painted. A neighbor named Carol Ennis, who lived 3 houses east of the Metz property, later told sheriff's deputies that she had seen Sherry outside at approximately 7:15 that morning, watering a row of potted geraniums along the front porch railing. Sherry had waved. Carol had waved back. That was the last confirmed sighting. Inside the house, According to what investigators later reconstructed, the morning had followed something close to routine. Kayla had eaten cereal. A bowl with a residue of dried milk was found on the kitchen table. Brianna had been dressed but not fed. The coffee maker had been used. A half-full pot remained on the warming plate, and a single ceramic mug, white with a faded logo from a 2000 Wyoming centennial celebration, sat on the counter beside it, approximately one-third full of coffee that had grown cold. The television in the living room had been on. Investigators noted it was still running when the first deputy arrived, tuned to a local morning news broadcast. Sherry's purse was on the hook beside the back door. Her keys, both her car keys and her house keys, were on the kitchen counter beside the coffee mug. Her Dodge Neon sat in the driveway, undisturbed, the windows still fogged with overnight dew. Dale Metz was not home. He had left, according to his own account, at approximately 6:30 that morning to drive to a job site near Atlantic City, Wyoming, a former mining community roughly 25 miles northeast of Lander, where he said he was framing a small addition onto a privately owned cabin. He said he had kissed Sherry goodbye while she was still in bed, had dressed quietly so as not to wake the girls, had stopped at a gas station on the north end of town for coffee and a breakfast sandwich, and had been on site by 7:15. At 9:45 that morning, Kayla Metz walked across the street to the home of a neighbor named Patricia Dunbar. Patricia later recalled that Kayla appeared calm but spoke with a strange, flat certainty that she found troubling. Kayla told Patricia that she could not find her mother and that Brianna was crying. Patricia crossed the street, knocked, found the door unlocked, and stepped inside to discover Brianna sitting on the kitchen floor amid the abandoned normalcy of that ordinary morning. The cereal bowl, the cooling coffee, the television still talking to an empty room. Patricia called 911 at 9:52. The first Fremont County Sheriff's deputy arrived at 10:09. He noted the position of the coffee mug. He noted the keys on the counter. He walked the property. The backyard gate was unlatched, though the family dog, a mixed breed named Chester, was still present and showed no signs of agitation. He noted that the geraniums Carol Ennis had seen Sherry watering were still wet. In the small notebook he kept throughout his career, the deputy, a man named Roy Caldwell, no relation to Sherry's maiden name, wrote 3 words beneath the date and address. He wrote them in capital letters, pressed firmly into the page. Something is wrong. The swing in the backyard hung perfectly still. The toy truck Brianna had been playing with the evening before lay on its side in the grass. Chester sat beside the back gate, watching the door. By noon on July 23rd, there were 9 vehicles parked on Sagebrush Lane. The Fremont County Sheriff's Office activated its search and rescue protocol within hours of the initial report. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, deputies had established a command post in the gravel lot of a nearby elementary school and were coordinating with Wyoming Department of Criminal Investigation agents who had driven up from Cheyenne. Search teams were organized into quadrants covering the immediate neighborhood: the open sage flats north of town, the Wind River to the east, and the network of 2-track roads that spiderwebbed into the Bureau of Land Management land surrounding Lander on 3 sides. Volunteers assembled at the community center on South 3rd Street. By the following morning, more than 200 people had signed in, filling out forms and receiving instructions in the gymnasium beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly in the morning quiet. The local newspaper ran the story on page 1. Sherry's photograph, a candid snapshot from a birthday party, her laughing with one hand raised to her mouth, was reproduced in black and white and taped to windows throughout downtown. Those who knew her said the community response was immediate and genuine. Lander was small enough that Sherry's face was a familiar one, and the image of two small girls without their mother was precisely the kind of thing that moved people to put on boots and walk into the heat. But even in those first hours, there were things that didn't settle right. Dale Metz had been reached by phone at 11:23. Deputies noted in their log that he was informed of the situation, that his wife was missing, that his daughters had been found alone, that officers were on scene. The log notes his response as acknowledged, which is a peculiar word to use when a man is being told that his wife has vanished from her own home with her keys still on the counter. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the quality of that response, not what was said, but what was absent from what was said. Dale arrived home at approximately 1:15 in the afternoon. Investigators observed him carefully. He embraced Kayla. He lifted Brianna. He stood in the driveway and looked at the house with an expression that one deputy later described in his notes as appraising. Not grief, not confusion, something more architectural than that. When investigators asked him to walk them through the morning when he had left, what Sherry had been doing, whether she had seemed unusual, his account was steady and sequential, delivered in a tone that two separate investigators later described independently, using the same word: rehearsed. The timeline on its face held together. Dale said he had arrived at the Atlantic City job site at approximately 7:15. A receipt from the gas station on North Wyoming Boulevard was time-stamped at 6:53, confirming a stop. The site itself was real. The cabin addition existed. The landowner confirmed that Dale had been working the project. But when investigators drove the route themselves, from the Metz residence on Sagebrush Lane to the gas station, then north on Highway 789 to the turnoff for Atlantic City, they noted that the drive to the site, under normal conditions, took between 35 and 40 minutes from the gas station. Dale's account of arriving at 7:15 placed his departure from the station at no later than 6:40, roughly 13 minutes before the timestamp on his receipt. 13 minutes is not, in isolation, much. People misremember timelines. People round numbers. Investigators noted it, logged it, and kept it among the accumulating small inconsistencies that were beginning to form a pattern without yet forming a picture. There was also the matter of the odometer. Dale drove a 1999 Ford F-250, dark green, with a cap over the bed. On the evening of July 22nd, the night before Sherry disappeared, a neighbor named Tom Beals had borrowed a socket wrench set from Dale and returned it at approximately 8:30. When he pulled into the Metz driveway, he had parked directly behind Dale's truck and had, on a reflexive habit he could not fully explain, glanced at the truck's rear plate. He had also, he told investigators, glanced through the driver's window and noticed the odometer, a habit formed during his years as a heavy equipment mechanic, who was always, automatically, reading gauges and counters. He remembered a number in the neighborhood of 67,400 miles. When investigators documented the truck's odometer reading on the afternoon of July 23rd, it showed 67,611 miles. The distance from Sagebrush Lane to the Atlantic City job site and back was approximately 50 miles. Tom Beals's remembered number, even allowing for the imprecision of memory, left a gap of roughly 160 miles unaccounted for. Investigators noted this. They noted the 13-minute discrepancy. They noted the word acknowledged. They noted the appraising expression in the driveway. And they found nothing else. No physical evidence tied Dale Metz to any harm. No forensic evidence of a struggle anywhere in the home. No blood. No trace material that didn't belong to the family. The dog had not barked, not that anyone remembered. The neighbors had seen nothing unusual after Carol Ennis's 7:15 wave. The search teams found nothing in the Sage Flats, nothing along the river, nothing on the 2 tracks. Cadaver detection teams swept relevant areas across 2 weeks without a result. Divers searched a section of the Wind River, nothing. Sherry Ann Metz had been a living woman with keys on her counter and coffee in her mug, and then she was not. Wyoming DCI assigned a lead investigator, an agent named Frank Orozco, 17 years with the department, known among colleagues for a particular patience that some mistook for slowness and others recognized as the rarest investigative asset there is. Orozco interviewed Dale Metz 4 times across the following 6 weeks. He noted that Dale's accounts remained consistent, in the way that accounts become consistent when they have been constructed rather than remembered. Organic memory shifts slightly with each retelling. Details move, emphasis changes. Dale's account did not shift, it replayed. Orozco wrote in his case notes, "Subject's narrative lacks natural variation, consistent beyond normal parameters." But consistency is not evidence. Suspicion is not evidence. 13 minutes and a neighbor's remembered odometer reading and the word acknowledged are not evidence. By the winter of 2002, the active search had scaled down. By the spring of 2003, Sherry Ann Metz was formally listed as a missing person, presumed deceased by investigators but not legally declared so. No arrest had been made. No charges had been filed. The file went into the archive of Fremont County's unresolved cases, a category that is never truly closed but that, in the daily reality of a small department with limited resources, is no longer actively worked. The swing hung still. The case went cold. The house on Sagebrush Lane was sold in March of 2004. Dale Metz had continued living there with Kayla and Brianna for 18 months following Sherry's disappearance, a period that neighbors described in later interviews as increasingly uncomfortable, not because of any specific incident, not because of anything Dale did or said, but because of the quality of the silence that seemed to have settled over the property like weather. The geraniums died that first autumn and were not replaced. The porch railing where they had sat went bare. Chester disappeared one day in the spring of 2003, and Dale told the girls that the dog had gotten out. He did not look for the dog. The neighbors noticed this. For those who have ever doubted someone they love, not with certainty, not with evidence, but with a low and persistent unease they could not quite name, the years that followed Sherry's disappearance would have felt recognizable to the people of Sagebrush Lane. It is a particular kind of suffering, the suspicion you are not permitted to express, the grief you cannot name correctly, the way you learn to look slightly past a person rather than directly at them, because looking directly requires you to decide what you are seeing. In March of 2004, Dale accepted a job with a construction company based in Casper, packed the truck, and loaded the girls into the cab. He left on a Wednesday morning before most neighbors were awake. One woman, a retired schoolteacher named Beverly Lund, watched from her kitchen window as the truck backed out of the driveway and turned north on Sagebrush Lane. She later said she felt in that moment something specific. Not relief that Dale was leaving, but a grief for the house itself, for the version of the house that had contained Sherry's geraniums and Sherry's coffee, and the ordinary noise of 2 small girls. Beverly Lund stood at her kitchen window for a long time after the truck disappeared, and she did not cry, but she felt the particular weight of a thing that has ended without concluding. In Casper, Dale Metz rebuilt a version of a life. He worked steadily. He enrolled Kayla in 4th grade and Brianna in kindergarten. He attended parent nights and signed permission slips. He met a woman named Sandra Howell at a church social in 2005 and dated her for approximately 2 years before the relationship ended. Sandra later told people only that Dale had been difficult to know, that there had always been something behind his eyes she could not reach. He did not remark publicly on the anniversary of Sherry's disappearance. He did not attend the annual vigils that Sherry's family, her parents, still living in Riverton, her younger brother Marcus, continued to hold on the 23rd of July each year at a small park near Landers downtown. Sherry's mother, Elaine Caldwell, told a local journalist in 2008, "Every year I think this will be the year we get an answer, and every year the 23rd passes and we don't, and then I have to figure out how to live in the year after that." Inside the Metz household, the Casper House, a rental on a quiet street near a park, things accumulated in the way that unspoken things accumulate. Kayla grew from 7 to 10 to 13. Brianna grew from 4 to 7 to 10. They attended school. They played sports. They functioned by external measure, as children do when adults teach them to function. But teachers noticed over the years certain things. Kayla had a habit of writing her mother's name in the margins of her notebooks, not as grief, not as tribute exactly, but compulsively, the way someone writes a word they cannot stop thinking about. Brianna, who had been 4 when her mother disappeared and retained only the most fragmentary conscious memory of her, drew families obsessively in elementary school. Always a mother, always 2 girls, always a dog. She often drew the mother figure outside the house, in the yard, facing away. A school counselor in Casper who worked with Kayla during her 6th grade year noted in her file, "Child demonstrates chronic hypervigilance in home environment, reports difficulty sleeping, has expressed, unprompted, that she does not feel safe." The counselor had recommended therapy. Dale had declined politely, and the file noted no follow-up. Clears throat. There are children who carry information they cannot fully articulate, who hold knowledge in the way the body holds trauma, not consciously, not narratively, but in the muscles and the sleep and the drawings of mothers facing away. Investigative psychologists who later reviewed the case materials would note this pattern. The hypervigilance, the compulsive writing, the drawings, not as evidence, which they could not be, but as the behavioral signature of children navigating an interior landscape that their circumstances had made dangerous to name. The years passed. They do that indifferently, without regard for resolution. Frank Orozco retired from Wyoming DCI in 2011, but before he cleared his desk, he spent 3 days reorganizing and updating the Metz case file. He printed a fresh copy of his original case notes. He reviewed the 13-minute discrepancy and the odometer gap. He added a summary memo addressed to his successor that read, in part, "This case remains unresolved." The primary subject of investigative interest was, and remains, Dale Metz. No physical evidence exists sufficient for charge. Witnesses from original canvas should be resurveyed for additional recollection. The daughters, now aged 16 and 13, may possess information not previously accessible to them or to investigators. This case deserves continued attention. He left the memo on top of the file. He turned off his desk lamp. He carried a box of personal items to his car in the parking lot of the DCI field office in Riverton, and he drove home. He had not solved the case. This was the thing he would carry in the remaining years of his career and well beyond it. Not failure exactly, but the unresolved weight of a woman who had stood on her porch watering geraniums at 7:15 in the morning and then ceased to exist. For those who have ever noticed the specific silence of a question that no one is answering, that is the texture of the Metz case in its middle years. A silence that was not empty. A silence that was full of the things no one could yet say. Dale Metz in the autumn of 2012 moved again. This time to Evanston, Wyoming, near the Utah border, a smaller community, farther from Fremont County, farther from the annual vigils, farther from the people who remembered the way he had stood in the driveway of his house on Sagebrush Lane with an expression one deputy had called appraising. Kayla, by then 18, did not move with him. She remained in Casper, enrolled in a nursing program at Casper College. Brianna, 14, moved with her father to Evanston. It was, perhaps, the separation from her father that allowed Kayla to begin, slowly and imperfectly, to find language for the things she had been carrying. She began therapy in Casper in the winter of 2013. Her therapist was a woman named Dr. Christine Polly, a licensed clinical psychologist who specialized in trauma and family systems. Over the course of many months, in the measured and painstaking way that buried things come to the surface, Kayla Metz began to speak about her childhood, about the feeling of the house, about the quality of her father's silences, about specific memories that had been present in her since childhood, but that she had never had a framework for understanding. She spoke about a memory from the morning of July 23, 2002. She spoke about what she had seen. She had been 7 years old. She was 16 years away from that morning. But the memory had lived in her with the particular clarity that certain moments possess, burned bright by proximity to something enormous. And in Dr. Polly's office, in the winter of 2013, Kayla Metz began to describe it. She had been awake earlier than anyone knew. She had come downstairs for water. She had heard voices, her parents' voices, coming from the utility area at the back of the house. Not arguing exactly. Something more controlled than arguing. Something more frightening than arguing. And then a sound she had not, at 7, had a name for. A sound she had given a name to later, as she grew older and accumulated experience and understanding and dread. She had gone back upstairs. She had not told anyone. She had been 7 years old, and some things are too large to speak when you are 7. And then the years pass and the thing grows heavier instead of lighter, and still you do not speak, because the person who would have to hear it is your father, and he is also the person you depend on to survive. Clears throat. In the spring of 2014, Kayla Metz contacted the Fremont County Sheriff's Office. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in April 2014. A detective named Sergeant Lisa Morrow had been assigned to the Metz case following Frank Orozco's retirement, as part of a cold case review initiative that Fremont County had implemented in 2012. She had read Orozco's memo. She had read the original case notes. She had noted the 13-minute discrepancy and the odometer gap in the word acknowledged and the deputy's capital letter notation. Something is wrong. When Kayla Metz called the non-emergency line and identified herself and said she had information about her mother's disappearance, the receptionist transferred the call immediately to Sergeant Morrow's desk. Morrow took notes in longhand. She later described that phone call as one of the most significant conversations of her investigative career, not because of its volume or its drama, but because of its precision. Kayla was 20 now. She had been in therapy for more than a year. She had not come to this call in pieces. She had come to it with the particular composure of someone who has spent a long time organizing a thing before carrying it forward. She told Morrow what she had heard on the morning of July 23, 2002. She described coming downstairs for water at an hour she estimated as between 6 and 6:30. She described hearing her parents' voices from the utility area, a space adjacent to the back door, where the washer and dryer were housed, and where a door led to the side yard. She described the quality of the voices, controlled, low, her father's voice with an edge she recognized from other moments as the particular tone of his anger. She described, then, the sound that had followed. She said, "It was a sound like something being moved, like weight, and then it stopped." She had gone back upstairs. She had heard her father's truck start. She had heard it leave. She told Morrow, "I have been trying to figure out what to do with that for 12 years. I don't know if it means what I think it means, but I think I know what it means, and I think I have to say it." Morrow documented the call in full and immediately contacted Wyoming DCI to request the reactivation of the case file. DCI assigned 2 agents, a senior agent named Tom Wyeth and a forensic specialist named Paula Gaines, who had an extensive background in soil and decomposition evidence. Fremont County and DCI entered a joint investigation agreement on April 29, 2014. The new investigative effort began with the odometer. Modern forensic accounting techniques were applied to Dale Metz's financial records from 2002, obtained via subpoena. Investigators identified fuel purchases made on Dale's debit card on the morning of July 23, the documented stop at the North Wyoming Boulevard station at 6:53, and a second purchase at a station in a community called Jeffrey City, approximately 80 miles northeast of Lander, time-stamped at 8:41. Jeffrey City is not on the route to Atlantic City. It is northeast of Lander, along Highway 287, in the direction of open, remote BLM land. The purchase had been in the original financial records subpoenaed in 2002, but it had been categorized at the time as a routine stop and not followed up. The sort of detail that in isolation means nothing and in accumulation means everything. Investigators now had a picture of a morning that did not travel in the direction of the story they had been told. Agent Paula Gaines coordinated with the Wyoming State Geological Survey to identify areas of interest along Highway 287 northeast of Lander. Specifically, areas of accessible terrain accessible from pullouts along the highway corridor, within a reasonable drive of Jeffrey City. The survey work, combined with historical aerial photography and ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted over several months in 2014 and 2015, identified 3 sites of interest. On August 14, 2015, 13 years and 22 days after Sherry Ann Metz watered her geraniums for the last time, investigators conducting a ground survey at a site approximately 11 miles north of a highway pullout near an unnamed dry wash located human remains. The remains were confirmed by the Wyoming State Crime Lab to be those of Sherry Ann Metz on September 3, 2015. Clears throat. The formal confirmation arrived on a Wednesday. Sergeant Lisa Morrow drove to Riverton to deliver the news to Elaine and Richard Caldwell in person. She sat in their living room, a room full of photographs, full of Sherry's face at every age, and she told them that their daughter had been found. Elaine Caldwell, who was by then 68 years old and had spent 13 years managing a particular kind of not knowing, received this information in silence. Then she said, "Can we go to her?" And Morrow told her gently that not yet, that there was still work to be done, but that yes, in time they would be able to bring Sherry home. Richard Caldwell, who had said very little throughout, stood and walked to the window. He stood there for a long time looking at the street outside. He did not say anything. His shoulders moved once. The forensic work continued through the autumn of 2015. The State Crime Lab, working with an expert in skeletal trauma from the University of Wyoming, completed its analysis. Cause of determination involved evidence of blunt force. The lab's findings were documented in a report that investigators would later describe in court proceedings as among the most important documents in the case. On March 11, 2016, a Fremont County judge signed an arrest warrant for Dale Allen Metz, charging him with first-degree wrongful homicide in the death of Sherry Ann Metz. The arrest occurred on the morning of March 14, 2016, at the residence Dale Metz had been renting in Evanston for the previous 4 years. Uintah County Sheriff's deputies, coordinating with Fremont County and DCI, arrived at the property at 7:45 in the morning. Neighbors on that Evanston street later described the scene. 4 official vehicles parked on the street in the pale March light, deputies in vests crossing the frost-stiffened grass to the front door. Dale Metz answered the door in work clothes, as though he had already been awake and preparing for a day, as though he had been, perhaps, prepared for this morning for a long time. He said nothing when they read the warrant. He did not resist. A neighbor who witnessed the arrest from across the street told the Evanston local paper, "He looked calm. That's what I remember most. He looked completely calm." Those who knew him in Evanston said they were shocked that Dale had been a quiet neighbor, a working man, someone who kept to himself, someone they would not have described as capable of the thing they were now reading about in their local paper. Those who knew him from Lander from the years before felt something different when the news reached them. Not quite surprise, something closer to the resolution of a pressure that had been building for 13 years. Sherry's brother Marcus Caldwell, who was interviewed by a Casper television station on the afternoon of March 14th, spoke carefully and precisely. He said, "I want people to understand that this is not an ending. My sister is not here. Nothing that happens in a courtroom brings her back. But there is a difference between a question that has no answer and a question that finally has one. And we have been living inside that question for 13 years. The news spread through Lander with the speed of news in small places, which is to say, within hours. The coffee shop on Main Street, the diner near the high school, the community center where 200 volunteers had once signed in to search for a woman who had watered her geraniums and waved at her neighbor. People who had made those searches, who had walked the Sage Flats in the summer heat of 2002, received the news with a specific mixture of vindication and sorrow. The confirmation that their instincts had been correct, combined with the knowledge that instinct, in the absence of evidence, had not been enough to change the outcome. The preliminary hearing was held in Fremont County District Court in April 2016. Dale Metz appeared in court in a dark blue button-down shirt and slacks, accompanied by a court-appointed defense attorney named Patrick Gorel. He entered a not guilty plea in a steady voice, standing with his hands clasped in front of him, looking at a point slightly above the judge's head. His expression was what it had always been, controlled, architectural, revealing nothing except the effort of revealing nothing. Several of Sherry's family members sat in the gallery, Elaine and Richard Caldwell, Marcus, and a cousin named Deanna Fowler who had driven from Denver. They sat close together, shoulders touching. After the hearing, Patrick Gorel told reporters outside the courthouse that the evidence against his client was circumstantial, that the presence of remains in a remote location and the testimony of a 12 years distant memory from a child who had been 7 at the time did not constitute the basis for a first-degree conviction. He said his client had cooperated fully with investigators and maintained his innocence. He said the loss of Sherry Metz was a tragedy, and that the family's grief was real and deserved, but that grief was not the same as guilt. Inside the courtroom, before the gallery emptied, Elaine Caldwell sat for a few minutes longer than everyone else. She had brought a photograph, a small one, wallet-sized, the same image the community center had enlarged and reproduced in black and white in the days after Sherry disappeared. She held it in her hand and looked at it. She did not speak. Then she put it carefully back in her pocket and stood and walked out into the Wyoming spring, where the sky above the wind rivers was the same impossible blue it always is, and where the wind, if you stood still and listened, still came from 3 miles away. Clear's throat. The trial proceedings continued across 2016 and into 2017. The prosecution presented the forensic findings, the financial records, the fuel purchase timeline, the odometer discrepancy, the testimony of Tom Beals and Carol Ennis and Patricia Dunbar. And they presented Kayla Metz, 22 years old by the time she took the stand, who sat in the witness box in a county courthouse in Lander, Wyoming, and looked once at her father, who sat at the defense table and looked back at her with that same controlled architectural expression, and then looked away and spoke. She described the morning of July 23, 2002. She described coming downstairs. She described the voices and the silence after the voices and the sound that followed the silence, and she said, "I was 7 years old and I didn't understand what I was hearing, but I am 22 now and I know what I heard, and I am done not saying it." The jury deliberated for 4 days. On November 9, 2017, Dale Allen Metz was found guilty of first-degree wrongful homicide in the death of his wife, Sherry Ann Metz. He received a sentence of life in the Wyoming State Penitentiary without the possibility of parole. He made no statement at sentencing. He was taken from the courtroom in handcuffs. His expression did not change. Kayla Metz, seated in the gallery beside her grandmother and her uncle and her cousin, absorbed the verdict without visible reaction for several seconds. Then she closed her eyes. She did not cry. When she opened them again, she appeared to have arrived somewhere she had been traveling toward for a very long time. Brianna Metz, who had been 4 years old on the morning her mother disappeared, and who had been raised for most of her life by the man now convicted of her mother's death, did not attend the trial. She had, investigators noted carefully, been in contact with Kayla in the years leading up to the proceedings. What she carried, and how she carried it, belonged to her alone. There is no version of this story that ends cleanly. Sherry Ann Metz was 31 years old when she died. She had geraniums on her porch railing. She had 2 daughters who needed breakfast and a dog named Chester, and a coffee cup she never finished. She had a neighbor who waved at her through the morning air. She had a brother who said, 13 years later, that the difference between a question without an answer and a question with one matters, that it has to matter, because living inside that difference is the thing that does not end. What the Metz case offers is not comfort. What it offers is this: that evidence, patiently gathered and carefully preserved, can outlast the confidence of those who believe they have escaped it. That a child who sees something she cannot name at 7 may find the name at 22. That 13 minutes and an odometer reading and a fuel receipt from a station on a road that led somewhere no one was supposed to go can, given enough time and enough care, become the shape of what happened. That Frank Orozco's capital letters, "Something is wrong," were not wrong, even when the system could not yet act on them. Sherry Ann Metz was buried in Riverton in the autumn of 2015, in the town where she was born, beneath the same Wyoming sky she had looked up at all her life. Her daughters placed flowers on the grave. The wind rivers were visible from the cemetery, blue and permanent on the western horizon. She was not forgotten, she was found. Clears throat. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share this episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.